Alright guys, we're going to look at polygons on this video and have a discussion about what polygons are. First off, this is a lesson where really and truly you're very few times in your 5th grade year do you have a lesson where you're not dealing with an operation. And what I mean by that is there's really no multiplying, there's no dividing, there's no adding or subtracting. Usually you don't see too many complex word problems with this or story problems. A lot of this lesson is based off of vocabulary and do you know how to classify shapes. And so this video we're going to talk about classifying polygons and really looking at what are called regular versus irregular polygons. So this set of notes here is what we usually give out to our 5th graders. I'm going to just type in a few things as we go along here. So the first sentence there, it says a blank is a two-dimensional plane figure made up of 3 or more line segments. And so I'm going to type in polygons. And as I'm typing and kind of going through this with you, I'll probably mention this a couple of times, but basically, see if I can't move that. I may not be able to move it. But basically, when you look at this lesson and you think about there it goes. If you think about what you're dealing with here, it is really just a lot of vocabulary and understanding what each definition is talking about and what it's representing. And so, really and truly, probably since kindergarten or maybe even earlier than kindergarten or as a kindergartner, you've been learning about shapes. And so a lot of times it gets forgotten about that those shapes that you learn about are considered to be polygons. And so it says a two-dimensional plane figure made up of 3 or more line segments. So you can go down to the picture here and you can kind of see that starting with a triangle and then kind of working your way up to an octagon, all of those shapes are considered to be polygons because they fit that definition. And so earlier I mentioned a word classifying. Classifying is where you need to now look at a shape and not really just have one answer or one definition for that shape. In other words, a lot of times as you grow up and you see a square, we call it a square. But classifying it from here on out is really you're looking at a square and you're looking at so much more than just a square. And that's going to be something that we kind of talk about throughout this week and when we get through all of our lesson over shapes is, you really need to be able to go a little bit more in depth than just calling it a square, basically. So, in other words, it's a little bit more complex and in depth than what you did learn as a kindergartner or even younger than that. But it's not hard. And again, a lot of it's just practice, and just like anything else in math, practice makes perfect. So you got to do it. So the next one here is 2 blanks, and it says blank blank have the same size and shape. Sides are congruent if they are the same length, and angles are congruent if they have the same measure of degrees. I'm going to type in here what I think should go, and I think this is what we've used in the last few years, and that is just congruent figures. And really, when it comes to this definition, I think probably the biggest thing that kind of comes to mind here is the word congruent. You need to know what the word congruent means. It's a very popular word, especially on STAR test questions. I've seen it quite often when it comes to our shape problems. And so congruent usually if I'm taking these notes in class with my students, we would probably go down to the bottom and write congruent and then talk more about it. But I would just say you just definitely need to know that congruent means the same. It has the same side length, it has the same angle, it's equal. You could think about all those things about congruent or congruency. The last one says a blank blank has all sides congruent and all angles congruent. And so I'm going to type in here what's known as a regular polygon. And regular polygons are basically what you see here at the bottom of the page. Every shape that you see, triangle, quadrilateral, pentagon, hexagon, octagon, those are all considered regular polygons because of how they're constructed. One of the things that you need to really look at, and I'm going to switch to a pen here, when you look at these shapes are going to start having little markings on them. And the markings are very important because they help you classify the shape. So in other words, when I look at that triangle, I see that, okay, yes, it is a triangle, but it's much more than just a triangle. It's a specific type of triangle. It could be a couple of different types of triangles, and we're going to talk about triangles this week as well. But like those little marks that you see, especially, we'll first start looking at the triangle on the sides. There's just kind of like a straight line, and I'm going to put a blue line there instead. Basically, what that's showing is that all the sides are the same. So, since I know all the sides are the same, then I know that, okay, well, hey, it's definitely a triangle. It's probably going to be what's called an equilateral triangle. But when I look at it even closer and more in depth, I could say, well, okay, hey, it's a polygon, but it's also a regular polygon. And so, and it even has more names to it than that, but we'll leave it at that. But like that's kind of the mindset that you need to have from here on out is when I look at a polygon or I look at a shape, you know, what all do I know about it? How detailed can I get when I describe it? You know, if I look at the one next to it, the quadrilateral there, it's obviously square comes to mind. But I could look at that and I could go, okay, well, hey, it's definitely a polygon. It's definitely a regular polygon because everything is equal, everything is congruent. But I could also call it a parallelogram. And so, again, that's kind of the mindset that you need to get into over this next week when we get into shapes. Because shapes is not a very long lesson. This is going to go pretty quick. We don't spend like weeks on shapes. So it's going to take a lot of practice and I think probably something I tell my students to do is, just in your, everyday business going throughout your, just everyday lives, look at shapes a little bit differently and practice it. I'm sitting here looking at a TV screen. Well, hey, it's a rectangle, but it's more than a rectangle. I could call it several different things. But again, that's kind of the mindset that you have to get into. And so back to regular polygons, the marks that you also could see are the angled marks. And I'm going to put these little blue marks a little bit bigger. And it's kind of hard for me to do it here, but I'm going to try my best on the quadrilateral. So those are also marks showing equal angles. And so that little square or that little box you should know from 4th grade because that's identifying that angle as a 90-degree angle. And so since all of the angles are 90 degrees and it has the line in the middle of the sides, I definitely know that is a regular polygon. Something that I want to make sure we're clear on is, and this is sometimes I forget to go over this with my kiddos, but polygons, when you think about that first definition, 3 or more line segments like this, a circle is not a polygon. This, if you were to see something like that, that's not a polygon. It's not closed. It needs to be a closed figure. And so there's definitely some examples of non-polygons. But I think probably the biggest one that I want to go over on the next couple of pages are what are called irregular polygons. All right, so on this page here, this is a really good example of regular versus irregular. And it kind of does a good job explaining it too. If you read it, on the left side, regular polygons, even though they don't have the marks, those are all, congruent sides and congruent angles. So they all look the same. Like if I just look at one of them, I could pick out the pentagon here. And I could definitely tell by just looking at it, everything is congruent. Versus the pentagon over on this side, that is not the same. It does not have the same side. So it's an irregular polygon, or you could call it an irregular pentagon. And then they kind of do a good job labeling, like sometimes the angles are equal, but the sides are not. And then maybe vice versa. Maybe sides are equal, but angles are not. Or the bottom one here, neither sides equal nor angles are equal. And so, again, it's just kind of that mindset of when you look at a shape, that's something you need to take into consideration. Most of your classic shapes that you learn growing up, especially as a little kid, are probably regular polygons because they're not trying to fool you. But as you get older, and especially in math, you start seeing more irregular polygons. Like we were doing a question the other day, and it was an irregular polygon because it was a type of perimeter problem, but it was a hexagon, but it was not regular. It had all different side lengths and stuff. So it's just something to kind of think about, regular versus irregular. All right, and then on this last page, I thought this was, again, just another good example of the difference between the two. I'm going to go down to one that looks kind of odd, but your octagon down at the bottom, when you see your kind of traditional octagon, a lot of kids always think of a stop sign, which is very true. That's a good example. That's a good one to think about. So traditionally, your octagon looks kind of, equal sides, equal angles, because you do think of that stop sign. That's what they look like. But, man, look at that next to it. That's weird. But, that's just a good example of, hey, that's still an octagon, but it's not a regular octagon or a regular polygon. You would think of that as irregular because, yeah, it's got all kinds of different stuff, going on it. But I think overall on this, there's not much I could do for you other than just explain, some of the key definitions that you need to know about. And, before I end the video, again, those would be know what a polygon is, know what the word congruent means. Congruent's very important. And then definitely know regular versus irregular and being able to know how to spot that. And before I sign off, I'll go and look at the triangle again up at the top. They don't do it here, but a lot of times, again, they'll have those marks. And I'll give you an example of what one doesn't look like. So, like if you look at the irregular triangle that's next to it, what it could have is a mark like this if it's not the same. So it might have one mark there on that side, and then it might have two here, and then three here to show that they're all not the same. And so that's something that you could look for, and they'll do that on angles as well. They might do that where, like it's hard for me to get really, really close here, but like that's a right angle. That's a right triangle. But this angle over here definitely is not, and then this one's different, so maybe it's like two curved lines. And they've got a lot of stuff going on, but that's, and of course I'm drawing it so it doesn't look very clean, but when they show you these, that's how you can always identify them as irregular versus regular, because if it were, a regular triangle or a regular polygon, it's going to have those consistent marks, whereas this one, definitely does not. So, again, think about those words, think about those things that are so important. When you look at shapes from now on, you might want to think about them in a lot of different ways other than just kind of your basic shapes. So that ought to help you out. I really would learn some definitions when we get into these shape lessons. It's a big help.